Hello and welcome everyone to this afternoon's event, and what I'm quite sure will be a frank, probing, respectful, and provocative discussion of our topic for today. Is Columbus Day still worth celebrating? My name is Peter Korotansky, and I'm the inaugural director of Cleveland State's Center for Civics, Culture, and Society. Our mission is both straightforward and ambitious: to explore the historical ideas, traditions, and texts that have shaped the American constitutional order and society. Our plans are to pursue this mission relentlessly in the courses we'll soon offer here at CSU, in our research, and in events like this one that engage the community, both here on campus and beyond. To be sure, we could not possibly accomplish this mission or even pursue it effectively without a willingness to confront difficult, controversial, and even sensitive topics of political and cultural significance. But we must do so in a way that avoids so many of the viciousness and pettiness all too common in today's discourse, in a way that's willing to disagree without becoming disagreeable, in a way that values reasoned discourse above rhetorical flair, and in a way that listens, truly listens, to those with whom we disagree. Our topic for today is one such controversial topic, and that's why we are deeply, deeply honored to welcome to campus two highly esteemed scholars, whom I might add have agreed to come on relatively short notice. Before I introduce these gentlemen, I would like to thank Kishore Jayabalan, the Assistant Director of the Center for Civics, Culture, and Society, without whose hard work today's event simply could not have happened, as well as Dr. Jill Gordon, the Dean of the Levin College of Public Affairs and Education, and for her willingness to share her college's beautiful atrium with us this afternoon. Immediately following our discussion at 5:30, there will be a reception with refreshments and hopefully continued discussion, to which everybody here is warmly invited, as you are also invited to events just like this one, sponsored by the Center for Civics, Culture, and Society, that we plan to host every month for this academic year. Please stay tuned for those details and see the QR code above me and on the tables for those details. Our program this afternoon will begin with our speakers each making a 20-minute presentation, followed by another 20 minutes or so of dialogue between them. And the final 30 minutes will be your opportunity to ask questions, which we kindly request be relevant to the topic, respectfully stated, and also concise so as to leave as much time as possible for the questions of others. And now for our speakers. First, Daniel McCarthy is the editor-in-chief of Modern Age, a conservative review, as well as vice president for publications at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. He is a nationally syndicated newspaper columnist and a columnist for Spectator World. He has previously worked as the editor of the American Conservative magazine and director of the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship Program at the Fund for American Studies. He's a graduate of Washington University in St. Louis, where he studied classics. Secondly, Dr. John Lau received his PhD in American culture at the University of Michigan and is an enrolled citizen of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians. He is also the recipient of a graduate certificate in museum studies and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Michigan. He is a professor emeritus from The Ohio State University and former director of the Newark Earthworks Center. And again, we are delighted that they could be with us this afternoon. We have determined that Mr. McCarthy will speak first, but please join me in extending a warm CSU welcome to them both. Thank you. Sorry, I'm just going to slideshow. No? Got it. not work? Oh. It's working on the screen here. Yeah. Do you want to come give me a hand here? Mm-hmm. Never used this.
Usually it's doing that.
Yeah. We can just leave it there. That's fine. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much. I am really very grateful to the Center for Civics, Culture, and Society here at Cleveland State University, not only for hosting me here, but also for having an event on this topic. Certainly, the question of which public holidays America should have, who it should honor, what events it should honor, has actually been something that Americans have debated going all the way back to the very earliest days of our republic. And the Columbus Day controversies are very much of a piece, I think, with the kinds of debates that Americans have had in a civic, but oftentimes, quite heated way over the last 250 years. So this set of remarks today, both for myself and then Professor Lau, I think will emphasize the civil part. It will emphasize the domain of reason rather than perhaps some of the polemics that were customary when Federalists were claiming that we should honor a Washington birthday and not the 4th of July. And Jeffersonians were arguing back in the early days of our republic that we should honor the 4th of July and, of course, the author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, and not put so much emphasis on George Washington's birthday. So that was a conflict right at the beginning of our republic, long before anyone had thought of Columbus Day. Well, it seems to me there are three broad categories of argument against Columbus Day and against honoring Christopher Columbus. The first is to say that Columbus Day honors something bad in itself, namely the European arrival in the Americas. If you view this as a tragic day in human history, or perhaps specifically in the history of the indigenous peoples who were here before Columbus, then you have a very good reason, of course, right from the start, to be opposed to Columbus Day. The second reason that one might oppose having a day in honor of Christopher Columbus is that it celebrates a bad man. And certainly Christopher Columbus is an individual who was complex. He was accused by many in his own time of being either a cruel admiral or a cruel governor of the places that he was put in charge of. So he was a man, much like our own founding fathers, of a mixed reputation, and someone we would not want to present as any kind of a saint, as any kind of purely sterling human character, but rather we're not looking for the individual here, we're looking for his achievement. We're looking to whether he accomplished something heroic, something for which we should all be grateful. And the third reason why we might scruple about having a day in honor of Christopher Columbus, a public holiday, a national holiday, is perhaps we simply think there are too many public holidays in general, and that national holidays may be something we simply don't need more of. Perhaps we have too many already. And that third point is actually something that I'm a little bit sympathetic to myself. In preparing for my remarks today, I did a little bit of looking at not only the history of our own public holidays, but also a bit of comparison study of public holidays in the UK and in Canada. And the United States is quite unusual, both in the number that we have and in the fact that most of our public holidays are in honor of particular individuals or particular events. They have or particular causes. They don't have the impersonal character that one finds in the UK. Now, there's something to be said for having public holidays that are more impersonal, simply because any individual that you might attach a holiday to, any individual whose name is involved in a national holiday, is going to be a source of controversy. They're going to be whatever flaws they may have had in their private lives, or whatever disgraceful elements there may be in their public record, are going to be grist for the mill of criticism and claiming that this should not in fact be someone that we honor. But if we honor anyone in the United States, if we honor anyone with public holidays, if we honor any cause as well as individual, It is the cause of the founding, and it's the cause of founders. And Christopher Columbus is indeed a founder of sorts of not our republic, but the very civilization that we have now here in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas in general, and in the United States in particular. It is as a founder, as a discoverer, that Columbus's reputation rises or falls, and the case for honoring him with a public holiday must also rise or fall on whether his role in opening the way to the New World for Europeans is something that should be celebrated or something that should not be celebrated, whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, and that's the fundamental question. As I say, the civic heroes we honor are not meant to be moral saints. They're meant to be honored for what they achieved, for what they contributed to the development of our own civilization. Now, almost all of us in this room, and in fact in this city and throughout the country, almost all of us in fact throughout the Western Hemisphere, owe our presence here to Christopher Columbus and to his opening of the way, not just for Europeans to come to the New World, but in fact for the New World to be integrated with the rest of the world as a whole, including ultimately arrivals from Asia and elsewhere. If we are grateful for our lives as Americans, we should be grateful to the man who made these lives possible. And if we're not grateful for the lives that we lead here, we should consider ourselves actually to be hypocrites, because in fact the lives we have as Americans and as inhabitants, for that matter, of the wider Western Hemisphere are very good lives, and historically these are lives that are among the most privileged that any human being has ever had over the course of human history. Now, it seems to me that every group, with possibly two exceptions, owes a tremendous debt of gratitude to Christopher Columbus. Obviously, European Americans are the first category that owes a tremendous debt to Christopher Columbus. We, would not be here were it not for Columbus. But I would also say that anyone whose ancestors came here voluntarily owes exactly the same debt to Christopher Columbus. It's because of the entire sequence of development that was started by Christopher Columbus's coming to the New World, which has led to a number of nation-states in the New World, especially right here in the United States, which have drawn immigrants from across the globe. And so anyone who comes here voluntarily must be grateful for what has been established here. Obviously, however, there are two categories which stand apart both from the European Americans and for those who immigrated voluntarily. There are, of course, those who immigrated involuntarily, those whose ancestors were brought to the Americas as slaves. And for them, it is, I think, more of a mixed question, of course, whether or not the civilization that exists in the Americas now and the role that Christopher Columbus played in planting the seeds of this civilization is an altogether unmixed blessing. But again, this is a debate that African Americans in particular have engaged in over the course of several decades. I think very much of a gentleman by the name of Ward Connerly, who was a regent of the University of California system, for example, an educator, a man of tremendous courage, who said that in fact he was very grateful that as much evil as his ancestors suffered as slaves and being brought to the New World in chains, nevertheless he was still a beneficiary of the fact that America ultimately is a nation that embraced freedom, and that he, as an heir to America's ideals, an heir to America's prosperity, to its security, is someone who is very grateful for the fact that he is in this continent and that he is not, in fact, living anywhere else in the world, in particular in Africa. So even among African Americans, there is indeed a debate about whether it, in fact, is a thing to be celebrated that we have the civilization that Christopher Columbus helped to plant in the Western Hemisphere, and again, ultimately in the United States itself. But then, of course, we have a final category, and that is the descendants of the inhabitants who are already in the Americas before the arrival of Christopher Columbus. And there it's very clear that what they lost is absolutely of incalculable value. And so while there certainly are Americans of indigenous, as Christopher Columbus would say, of Indian descent, who are very happy to be Americans today and who very much celebrate the civilization that has been built up here ever since Christopher Columbus first landed in the Western Hemisphere. Nevertheless, the losses are so tremendous that it's quite understandable if anyone of American Indian ancestry finds Christopher Columbus to be a figure not only very much of mixed or in fact very dark legacy, but even a figure who probably should not be honored at all with a public holiday which is going to be a holiday for, in fact, all Americans and everyone in our country. that there are good individual group reasons why one might say that Christopher Columbus, because he was catastrophic for one's own group, therefore should not be honored by the nation as a whole. So if we simply were to think about this in terms of democracy, in terms of whether a majority of the people who are here now owe Christopher Columbus a debt of gratitude, or on the contrary, should be critical of Christopher Columbus because of the pain and suffering that he and those he brought over inflicted upon the indigenous peoples of the Americas. If we simply were to do it in democratic terms and to ask what the population base of America today, whether or not they owe more gratitude or more criticism to Christopher Columbus, overwhelmingly the numbers would favor gratitude. So again, even if you yourself have tremendous reasons for thinking that Christopher Columbus it was not entirely a good thing that he discovered the Americas for the Europeans. Nevertheless, if you yourself would not be here were it not for Christopher Columbus's discovery, it would be a very ungenerous thing, to say the least, for you not to honor Columbus as a forefather of yourself and of those who came over as a result. Again, that applies not only to European Americans, but to all Americans who came here voluntarily. But of course, this is not quite sufficient. We're not simply going to judge the merits of Columbus Day and of Columbus himself on the basis of a purely democratic debt of gratitude that may be owed to Christopher Columbus. There also has to be a matter of universal principle. Can we make the case that Columbus's arrival in the New World was universally a good thing, and that everyone, even if their own group perhaps has a mixed view of Christopher Columbus or even a negative view of Christopher Columbus, that in fact absolutely everyone in America today should in fact have some degree of gratitude towards him for the discovery of the New World for the sake of the Europeans? Well, I would say there are three universal claims that can be made in defense of honoring Christopher Columbus. The first is the claim that Columbus himself would have made. Columbus saw himself as bringing the light of the gospel to the lands he discovered. Now, Columbus, of course, was not quite sure what lands he had discovered. He had come to what we now refer to as the New World, attempting to create trade routes actually to the Far East, attempting to create trade routes to Japan and to the Spice Islands of the East. Nevertheless, wherever he was going to wind up, and Christopher Columbus, of course, undertook a very brave endeavor by going upon the open seas, risking his life, risking the lives of his crew, without having any guarantee of surviving the voyage. What Columbus was trying to do, whatever he may have discovered, he wanted to advance the Gospels, he wanted to advance the spread of Christianity to whatever foreign lands he might come across, whether they were the already known lands of the Far East or, as it happened to be, these new lands of the Americas. So if you are a Christian, you should certainly reflect on what Christopher Columbus did in allowing the gospel of Christianity to spread more widely around the world. But I would say even beyond Christians, anyone who is a monotheist should also have a certain amount of honor for Christopher Columbus as a result of this. The fact that Judaism, for example, is in America owes a great deal to the fact that Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas for Europeans, which includes, in many cases, Jews. The year 1492 is actually of tremendous historical significance, not just because of Columbus's voyages, but it's also, rather darkly, the year in which the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, of Castile and Aragon, the year in which they expelled from Spain the Jews of Spain, which was really kind of the last and culminating episode in several hundred years of expropriation of Jews, exiling of Jews from European kingdoms. It was a really terrible thing. Machiavelli, in fact, even Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli, who was a teacher of evil in so many respects, even Machiavelli thought that the expulsion of the Jews from Spain was an act of cruelty. But the Jews would eventually get a place to go, a place of safety, a place of haven in the New World, thanks to the availability of the New World for the creation of new kinds of states that would not be simply driven by a kind of monolithic religious zeal to have only one religion present. that in fact, having the United States, having a pluralistic society such as our own, which is a tremendous benefit to the Jews, is something that was made possible by the fact that we had this new world discovered, which then could be, in which new kinds of states could be developed and planted. Finally, I would even say that Muslims too should be very grateful to Christopher Columbus for opening the new world to the old world. Because again, while we often think of this in terms of Europeans, whatever that term might mean, Europeans discovering the new world, in fact, it really is Christopher Columbus who connects the new world with the old world as a whole, ultimately making possible the arrival in the new world of persons from Asia as well, including South Asia, including East Asia. Christopher Columbus also makes possible the arrival of Muslims from the Middle East, at length in the New World. It's not through exploration of a Turkish admiral that Islam comes to be connected with the Americas. It's rather through the knowledge that these Europeans had discovered new lands or lands unknown to them that leads to a connection of the Americas with not just Europe, but also with the Islamic world, also with the wider world beyond. So on those grounds of monotheism and the monotheistic faiths, I think Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have tremendous reason to be gratitude for this enlargement of the ecumen, this enlargement of the known world that Christopher Columbus made possible. But of course, there are other kinds of universal values as well that are not dependent on religion. One of them being a sort of Enlightenment philosophy. One might look to Kant and Voltaire and others and ask whether those who consider themselves the philosophical heirs of the Enlightenment should be grateful to Christopher Columbus or not. And it seems to me there too, overwhelmingly the answer is they should be grateful and they should acknowledge Christopher Columbus as a man who made possible the spread of the Enlightenment version of reason across the globe and especially to the Americas. Now, Columbus himself lived before the Enlightenment. He was not, perhaps thinking of himself as someone who would bring a new style of reason, who would bring literacy and the ideas of later philosophers to the New World. Nevertheless, it was his achievement that made possible the arrival in the Americas of the Enlightenment philosophy, which ultimately, of course, plays a great deal of influence in creating the United States itself. Not by any means the sole influence, but it is nevertheless a very key component. So if you celebrate the Enlightenment, if you want to be proud of that facet, not only of Western civilization, but of reason itself as a universal consideration, Christopher Columbus helped to advance the cause of reason in that respect as well. Finally, I will say that there is even a cause to honor Christopher Columbus, or at least respect Christopher Columbus, and to have good reason to support a Columbus Day named after him, even if you reject the Enlightenment, even if you reject these monotheistic faiths and their values, even if you consider yourself the staunchest possible anti-colonialist and opponent of the spread of Western ideals or the spread of Enlightenment ideals, or indeed the spread of Christianity or other faiths. Even if you are a person of the quite radical revolutionary left who opposes all of these things, nevertheless, Christopher Columbus is a figure deserving of tremendous respect, because even the most staunch opponent of the Enlightenment and the staunchest opponent of Christianity, the staunchest opponent and critic, the harshest critic of Western civilization, nevertheless partakes of the technology that Western civilization has helped to bring to the New World, the technology that in fact is essential even for the opponents of Western ideals in order to mobilize their own forms of resistance. So technology is a kind of universality which even the opponents of the ideas that I mentioned earlier must avail themselves of. And Christopher Columbus certainly did inaugurate a technological revolution, certainly in the Americas themselves, but really by connecting the Americas with the rest of the world, he helped to accelerate the technological development of the entire planet. So as a user of modern technology, you too should be grateful to Christopher Columbus. In all these respects, Christopher Columbus is basically the father of us all, at least in this new world. And that includes the critics of colonialism, it includes today's descendants of pre-Columbian peoples, as well, of course, as all of those who emigrated here voluntarily, all of the Europeans, but also all of the successive waves of immigrants who've come willingly. And again, among African Americans, there is a great deal of argument about, the ultimate outcome of history here in creating a world in which it's possible for African Americans now to flourish, despite the horrible evils that were inflicted upon Africans who were brought to the New World as slaves. We should certainly not forget Christopher Columbus's flaws, but we must honor him as, again, our common father in the New World, and Columbus Day is a day properly set aside for such an honor. Thank you.
Do you want to come up and
Just click on that. Is that? If we just click on that. Oh. There. That's about as good as we're going to be able to do, unfortunately. Sorry.
good? Okay, thank you, sir. Well, good afternoon. Bonjour, Nijniga. Hello, how are you? I'm Professor Lau. Thank you for the opportunity to come speak with you. Thank you to the organizers from Cleveland State. Thank you for my esteemed colleague and his comments. I appreciate those, and always happy to talk about Columbus Day. And so I'm going to break this up, my talk, into sort of and some of these have already been touched upon fairly, I think. Some I want to emphasize, the man, the myth, the consequences and costs, and the alternatives to a Columbus Day holiday. So I want to start with, and correct me if I'm wrong, I was limited to Google, but I have it down from good sources, which means AI, that the Cleveland State University Faculty Senate approved Indigenous Peoples Day in 2021. The Cleveland State University officially adopted Indigenous Peoples Day in 2023. So, if that's correct? Okay, I'll say it's correct. And so, why are we going back to the same old tired arguments? It's already been decided, right? And smart minds have already concluded. By the way, there was polling taking place during that period. 70% of the students at Cleveland State supported changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. So, I'd like to close my book right there, but I have more to say. So, yeah, the man. It seems like, yeah, there's lots of complicated peoples in history, in American history, that we honor. We're all complicated, but Columbus seems to be particularly complicated to me. He sent a message back after he had landed, telling the Spanish queen and king he's speaking about the Taino people, they should be good servants. I, our Lord, being pleased, will take hence, at the time of my departure, 6 natives for your highness. So, he didn't discover America. Leif Erikson discovered America. But he did initiate the first slave trade, right? Is that a holiday that we want to celebrate? The first slaver. I don't, and I'll ask you to think about that. So, some of the Father de las Casas wrote about the treatment by Taino and Arawak people after the Spanish landed, wrote a critique. They would cut an Indian's hands and leave them dangling by a shred of skin. They would test their swords and their manly strength on captured Indians and place bets on slicing off heads or cutting bodies in half with a blow. So, for indigenous people, me included, Columbus represents the start of a brutal colonial era, the Atlantic slave trade, and the genocide of Native people, and the dispossession of their lands. So, how did we get to this holiday? So, it wasn't so much of a big deal until Washington Irving wrote a biography called The History and Life and Voyages of Columbus. He wrote that in 1828. The Knights of Columbus began lobbying, and there's a whole history behind that. Italians not being accepted, not being considered white enough, being oppressed, marginalized. And so it was an effort to have Italian Americans and Catholics also given a fair deal. The holiday, it's not as if we've been celebrating this holiday forever. It's not like one of those cherished elements of essential American history. Franklin Roosevelt made it a holiday in 1937. 1937, less than 100 years ago. It only became a federal holiday in 1971. 1971. Many states now have eliminated Columbus Day as a celebration and replaced it with Indigenous Peoples Day to recognize the consequences, the sacrifices that Native people had to make so that America could be America. I'm an American. I love America. My dad was a vet in World War II. My uncle was a vet in Korean War. My cousin and my aunt were vets in the Vietnam War. You know, we serve, we protect America too. Many of my fellow Native peoples have served proudly under the United States flag. But to ask us to celebrate somebody like Christopher Columbus has been difficult for many Native people. So, what are some of the myths about Columbus? He was an American, so what's he got to do with having an American holiday? He never even came to the United States, so why are we celebrating him? He didn't discover that the earth was round. The Greeks knew that. His contemporaries knew that. You look at the horizon and you can pretty much figure out that the earth is round. He didn't discover anything. The land was already occupied by millions of indigenous Native peoples. Now, from my perspective, from my grandmother's perspective, Goldie, she would call this the old world and that the new world, right? There's no new world and old world going on here. It's just the world. He did, as I mentioned, initiate the slave trade. A checkered past, to say the least. This is an image of a contemporary of his taking care of the Indian problem, apparently. Right? I'm old enough that I call people not from my tribe, Potawatomi, I call other Indians. Apologize if anyone doesn't like that, but I'm an old man. Okay, so it's tough to change. So once governor of Hispaniola, on his second or third time here, Columbus became governor, and he tortured and murdered thousands of native people. His men used native girls as young as 9 and 10 as sex slaves. And so the results were intentional genocide and murder, but also with the diseases that were brought, just impoverishment, death, conflict. For instance, the population of the Taino in Hispaniola in 1495 was several hundred thousand. By 1548, 500. So it's a difficult history to confront. So Columbus was fired. Not sure how many people know that, but he got fired by the Spanish crown. Should Columbus be on our list of holidays? To be sure, he led a European expedition to America. He was an explorer. I will give him that. He was a seafarer. He established regular contacts between Europe and America with tremendous consequences, not all of them good. But what does this Genoese seaman who sailed for the Spanish crown that was then expelling Jews and Muslims, he lived a very long time before the emergence of the United States, had no real connection to the United States. What does he have to do with our democratic republic? And my colleague mentioned, we're not just a democracy, a rule of the majority, thank goodness, right? We're a republic too. We do what's right. So he was not a fan, probably had no idea about or didn't even conceptualize democracy or republicanism or religious liberty. So he's a difficult person for people to embrace. So, and I would close then. Well, let me comment on a couple of things that my colleague said. So he brought light to darkness. He brought, I'll paraphrase this, civilization to the savage. That's not true. We were already very civilized people. You know, you look around, the Hopewell people, the Mississippian people, the Iroquois people, the Haudenosaunee, who probably shared with Benjamin Franklin the idea of a democracy because they were a democratic government up in New York, what's now New York. The spreading of the gospel, you know, that's, I suppose if you're an evangelical Christian, that gets you excited. But for the rest of us, it's sort of like, what about multiculturalism and respect for other people's religion? We were not godless. We were also, many of us, monotheistic too. We believed in a creator. Didn't we have a right to our religions, to our God? But at whose expense was all of this goodness being brought? The technology that came over, yeah, there was a lot of tech, mostly based upon the exploitation of the resources already here that were native resources that weren't being exploited, but we lived sustainable lives. But we have a thing called traditional indigenous knowledge. You might read a book, New York Times bestseller, Pulitzer Prize winning, Robin Wall Kimmerer, who also happens to be Potawatomi, braiding sweetgrass. We have a lot of knowledge that was current then, relevant to today. And my students used to ask me, well, Professor Lau, you're always talking about how sophisticated your Indians were. Why didn't they invent the wheel? And I said, we didn't need it. We had rivers. We invented the canoe. Why didn't you invent the canoe? And so they, I usually, So, as an alternative, I'm going to think of an indigenous holiday that is perhaps a little different than what's been proposed so far, but I think my time might be almost up. So, oh, okay. Well, then I'll talk about this new holiday. So, I'm thinking of an Indigenous Peoples Day, not a Columbus Day, but an Indigenous Peoples Day. Some of my own friends and family would be upset with this, but I'm going to lay it out to you for the very first time. How about an Indigenous Peoples Day that celebrates everybody's indigeneity? It's not just me that's indigenous or my colleague. We're all indigenous from somewhere. We're all of some place. Now you could celebrate, I'm obviously not my phenotype would disclose, right, that I've got some European in me. I'm Irish American. I could celebrate that part of me. Or maybe, Italian American would be a great thing to celebrate. Or maybe I don't care about all that background. I want to celebrate China or India or Africa. Or I want to celebrate that I'm indigenous to Ohio. I've lived here 3 generations, and that's my identity. Go for it. So I would say we can have an indigenous holiday that offends nobody, includes everybody, and is a real cause for celebration in the American way. Miigwech, thank you.
Well, thank you. I very much appreciate those remarks, and they certainly do fill in, many of the criticisms that I, suggested were out there, but had not, of course, been able to relate myself. I would maybe disagree with a few points, and then perhaps raise questions about others. One area where I would disagree is saying that before Columbus there was no New World, Old World. There was just the world. In one sense, that's true, of course. And you're exactly right that new and old here are relative terms, and they're going to look differently depending on which side you're standing on. But there wasn't the world, because the world was actually split up into different zones which had relatively little communication, perhaps even no communication with one another, before Columbus came to what Columbus thought of, what Europeans will ultimately think of as the New World. And again, maybe Columbus himself didn't think of it as the New World, maybe he thought it was Japan, but we'll footnote that for now. So one of the arguments that I was making was that Columbus created, or helped to create, a unified world, a combination of cultures and civilizations. And in that sense, Columbus actually is sort of a hero of multiculturalism. He was bringing into communication peoples that otherwise didn't have this degree of communication. And even more than that, he was making possible further communications later on. And basically, the fact that we have a globalized world now owes a good deal to Columbus and other, intrepid Europeans of the age of exploration. That the current understanding, which, geographically speaking, this is all there is to it, really, the current understanding of the world as a unified thing with, human populations everywhere. This is something that is a product of the age of exploration. Before that, it's true you had individuals like Leif Erikson, perhaps a handful of others over the course of millennia, who had gone from one continent to another, or gone from Europe to North America. But there was no sense of integration of these peoples, no sense of integration of these elements, these cousins in humanity, into a single whole. And that's why I made this argument, strange as it might sound, about universalism, because the idea that we now have a universal humanity, again, it didn't originate with Christopher Columbus, but Columbus made it practical, or helped to make it practical, in a way that informs our understanding today. So that's one area of disagreement. I think we didn't actually have the world before Columbus. We had a world in the Americas that was rather separate from and distinct from the other worlds around them. And really, Europe and Asia were a semi-integrated world already. There was still more to be discovered in Australia and elsewhere. Regarding Indigenous Peoples Day, I sort of agree and disagree with you on a few points. You say that everyone is indigenous somewhere, and in a sense that's true, but I think it's actually more true to say that everyone is not indigenous. No one is indigenous, in fact, because all peoples everywhere, and this includes the indigenous populations of the Americas before the arrival of Columbus, they ultimately originate someplace else. Perhaps there is, some, sense of indigeneity purely in Africa, where the human race first evolved, but everywhere else has been a matter of the introduction of human beings from other places. And every time you've had an introduction of human beings from one area to another, you've had many of the same tragedies and horrors that accompanied the connection of Europe to the Americas. You've had the arrival of new diseases, which have often led to population reductions, just horrible diseases wiping out, millions of people. This, of course, is something that happened between Europe and Asia time and time again over the course of centuries. The bubonic plague, for example, probably arrives from perhaps someplace in what is now Russia, but is certainly something that arrives and causes tremendous damage. Contrariwise, there's also the arrival of New World diseases, such as syphilis, in Europe. So disease is not partial. Disease is something that will occur anytime you have this new connection of human populations that previously did not have communication with one another. In saying that no one is indigenous, I'm also saying that if we look at the arrivals of any group of new people in a new territory, this arrival is often accompanied by conquest, and it's often accompanied by tremendous bloodshed. And certainly, Christopher Columbus did not introduce warfare to the Americas or anywhere else. This was something that was not invented by any one group of human beings in one part of the world. Warfare is something that, in fact, is pretty much everywhere. So too is slavery, and so too, the New World, the Americas. They had a number of evils which, in fact, had been eliminated in Europe over the course of centuries, eliminated in part through the influence of Christianity, which still persisted in the Americas. This included cannibalism, it included human sacrifice, it included a number of grave evils. Now, of course, one of the criticisms one could make of the whole idea of not your notion of Indigenous Peoples Day, but the conventional notion of Indigenous Peoples Day, is that it's doing an injustice to the indigenous peoples themselves, because they are indeed peoples plural. And these vices I've described, Aztec human sacrifice, the cannibalism of the Caribs, these were not practices that were spread across all peoples in the Americas by any means. These were very unusual practices, or at least practices that were carried out by some peoples but not others. So there too, I think the very concept of indigeneity is somewhat questionable, both because indigenous peoples themselves are a very mixed bag, have their virtues and their vices, but also because everyone has arrived at some point. And we know from the sort of unfortunate bloody record of history that any time you have new arrivals in a territory that already has a population, you almost always see conflicts between these new arrivals and the existing population. And Columbus is not unusual in being a bringer of conflicts as well as a bringer of communication and connection between peoples. So on those grounds, I would actually say Indigenous Peoples Day can be as problematic as Columbus Day. It has many of the same marks against it that one might level against Columbus Day. I think we should honor Columbus, again, make the case that the particular kind of civilization we have now, and it's not to disregard the existing civilizations that existed in the Americas before the arrival of Christopher Columbus. There certainly were civilizations, But the civilization that we actually have today now is, of course, a fruit of an extension of European civilization. And it's something that has benefited not just Europeans, European Americans, but in fact has benefited everyone here now. And that too is something which we should be grateful for, and we should be grateful for to Columbus for making that possible. So with that, I'll conclude my sort of responses and be happy to hear further responses from you.
Thank you, sure. So, Christopher Columbus starting the beginning of globalization. That might have happened, probably would have happened at some point in the future, but the manner that it happened in 1492 commenced was not in a good way, right? It was about, as you say, conquest, conflict, and you mentioned the bringing over of Western civilization, which we've all benefited from. In the United States, Native peoples had a 90 to 95% die-off from disease. And that's a consequence. And so we had civilizations. We could not maintain those civilizations. Can you imagine how this chat would go if, in a blink of an eye, 95% of you were gone? What would happen? What would happen to Cleveland State if you went on campus tomorrow and 95% of the people were gone? Oh, well, the university isn't running so well. Yeah, it's not going to run so well. And so our civilizations were not just under attack by enslavement and impoverishment and dispossession of the lands, but also by disease. And disease we couldn't fight, right? That was something we could not fight. I find it interesting to think of nobody's indigenous from anywhere except maybe Africa. So we have scientific theories about the origin of human beings, and that's all good, at least with Native people, and perhaps with some of you or all of you too. We also have other stories, stories that our grandparents told us, or stories that our church tells us, or stories that we get from whatever, right? To suggest, for instance, that, science doesn't support the book of Genesis and Adam and Eve, so throw that out. That's wacky. Native people, at least from my community, have a strong ethos that you never tell somebody else that their story is wrong. You do not have the right to do that. You have the right to believe your own story. You do not have the right to impose your story on someone else. I am indigenous. Archaeologists will say we've been here 20,000 years and came from Eurasia. That's one story. Even if we've been here only 20,000 years, come on, how long do we have to live here before we're indigenous to this place? Do you know what your relatives were doing 20,000 years ago? The same thing my relatives were doing, right? So our own stories tell us we've been here since the beginning of time. So we are indigenous to this place. We walk on the bones of our ancestors with respect. That is a central tenet in my community, most Native communities. Mostly around the world, you'll find stories that they've always been there. We're all indigenous. We can claim a spot. We don't all claim origin from East Central Africa. May be true, but we don't necessarily have to claim that. I claim the stories that my grandmother told me. You can claim the stories of what you know about your ancestry. If your stories are that, well, we come from Spain, or we come from Zimbabwe, or we come from Egypt, or we come from Syria, or we come from China or Japan. Don't you feel indigenous to those places? Isn't that the homeland? You may not have a close affinity to it, but if you want, why not have a holiday where if you wanted to, we could celebrate that? And frankly, the Irish get St. Patrick's Day. Why can't the rest of us celebrate where we come from? And so, the talk about, well, this civilization of darkness, well, they were cannibals here. They did human sacrifice here. Not in the United States, not in North America, that certainly not north of Mexico. Maybe the Aztecs did that. That's not my people. And they don't celebrate Columbus Day down in Mexico. Maybe the Incans or the Mayans, maybe they did all that stuff. I don't know. I haven't talked with them. But I know that Indian people in the United States didn't do that stuff, right? We were very respectful. We were married within clans, outside of clans, multi-tribal. We had a lot of a sustainable way of living. We had a high, we lived longer. If mortality rate is any measure of how you're living, our mortality rate was, Indians was about 60. In Europe, it was 40. Why do Europeans drink wine? Because the water's too polluted to drink. It's been that way for 1,000 years. Our water was pure, right? Our water was clean. And so there's a lot of reasons why I'm not suggesting that we forever be, cornered off from each other. I'm not a Luddite. I understand that this is going to happen. Globalization is going to happen. Not the Atlantic slave trade, though. I don't think Columbus can ever get over that hurdle as the first slaver, first European slaver in North America. And so I just don't think that those, I'm biased, of course, but I like my idea of a more inclusive, more happy, more celebratory, less divisive holiday, Indigenous Peoples' Day. Miigwech, thanks.
So I don't know how much longer we have for our, tete-a-tete. Well, I'm glad you corrected yourself there towards the end. Christopher Columbus was certainly not the first slaver, certainly not even the first slaver in the Americas. First European slaver in the Americas, yes, that is something of which he is guilty. Beyond that, I'm very happy you mentioned that you don't want to see the world sort of fragmented off in a series of isolated sort of islands from one another that have no interaction with each other. But as far as this idea that one story is as valid as another, even if one accepts that as true, it's the case that there are competing stories. There are stories that people tell that each lay claim to a same patch of land, for example. And of course, some peoples, and historically these are the peoples who tend to be, they acquire power. Some peoples have universal stories, and those universal stories lead to a degree of success for these peoples that often are not matched by peoples who have more local stories. When I point this out, I'm not making a moral claim there. It may be the case that those who make local stories are morally correct and those who make universal claims are incorrect, although I would say that if that were the case, we would have a very hard time saying what's correct and what's not, because localities would mean there's no universal notion of correctness. It would just be a matter of power as to which one was going to prevail. But bracketing that and putting it aside, the universal civilization is a very difficult thing to escape from. And you're quite right. You've got the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade and any number of other evils. But of course, you also have the horrors of a slave trade that went east, that involved Muslims and Arabs taking Africans as slaves and exporting them to the Ottoman Empire and elsewhere. So universal civilizations, whether it's an Islamic civilization, a Christian civilization, or any number of others, they almost always wind up being more powerful than local civilizations, small civilizations. And this is a tragedy. This is certainly something that leads to a tremendous loss of life for those who don't have universalistic horizons. Yet it is an inevitability, and that's why I made my point about technology. Technology is a universalistic horizon that is very difficult to escape. And one might say that one has non-technological means of producing the same results, but when this is put to the test between technology and other means, the technology tends to win out, and rather dramatically so.
Okay, we'd like to take this time to open it up to questions from you all, and we will do so if you guys don't mind sharing the remaining microphone. I don't know if anyone has any questions, but if you do, I'd be happy to bring the microphone around. Yeah.
That's okay. Yeah, thank you both for this talk. It's really interesting to listen to the discussion. I guess it is a comment more than a question, but it's a comment that you can respond to, and it's mostly for you, Mr. McCarthy. Looking at the sort of argument that you gave, right, I wonder if it basically just proves too much. I'm not necessarily opposed to having every day be a holiday, but it seems like if we use the 3 universal value sort of formula that you've given, there's a lot of people that we should probably go ahead and have holidays for. I mean, I'd love a John Stuart Mill day, a Lady Lovelace day, a Gutenberg day, a Locke day. It seems like those 3 values you described, maybe not all of them exactly right to the fullest degree in every case I just mentioned, but certainly all 3 of them to various degrees, and all 3 of them certainly in some cases. You could tell pretty much the exact same story you told for Columbus for those. Now, they may not just apply to the United States. They would also apply to many other countries, it turns out, right? But it seems like in that context, this suggests either that the sort of formula, the test that you've given, is too strong, or again, I mean, happy to go the other way, which is that we should just get rid of work entirely and have every day be a holiday, which would maybe be wonderful as well. So I just wanted to see what your thoughts are on that. That it seems like the case being made here, because it wasn't really all that unique to Columbus in any way, is just too broad or too strong of a case to be making.
Well, I think the particular case with Columbus is a practical case. So while one can point to any number of philosophers and thinkers and others who have contributed to the creation of the world as we know it today, and in particular the creation of the United States and the lives that we all enjoy now, Christopher Columbus, of course, uniquely was the European who created this connection between the Americas and Europe, and then created the flows which ultimately, set the pattern for those flows. Not that one wants to give him excessive credit, but again, you can say he's the first. And maybe Leif Erikson would be a alternative there, but I don't think so, because Leif Erikson, of course, it does seem as if he reached the continental shelf, at least, of North America, but doesn't wind up creating an ongoing connection between Europe and the Americas, whereas Christopher Columbus does. And we can say quite concretely and specifically that without Columbus, you would not have the connection between the Americas and Europe, and then the wider world beyond that. Now, you could say, of course, well, if Columbus hadn't done it, somebody else would have, and I think that's a very fair argument. Clearly, that's the case. And yet, Christopher Columbus was the one who actually did do it. So sometimes when one, visits art galleries, you'll hear someone say, "Oh, my grandmother could have painted that. My kid could have painted that," but they didn't. And Christopher Columbus did. He's the one who actually historically is the point of connection between the Americas and Europe. And then the wider world as well.
My only thought is that I like that idea of every day is a holiday, especially if we get it off. So, but that's a tough crowd. I usually have classes. I have classes that smile more than this. And I think also, this might be a tough audience, be a different audience in Chicago, be a different audience in a lot of metropolitan areas where there are Native people. Any Native, Indigenous, American Indian people in this room, other than me? Okay. Because usually when I talk about how, well, the consequences of Columbus is a 90 to 95% die-off of the indigenous population, you know, that's, I don't usually have to go further than that for explaining why I'm uncomfortable with this holiday. So.
Well, but let me respond to that, though, because clearly most of that die-off is a result of the disease. And anytime you would have had a connection between what Columbus thought of as the Old World and the Americas, those diseases would have come over. So it's, you know, you can't attribute the blame specifically to him. Or if you are, you have to, you know, then allow that Columbus also brought good things, too. And especially for, you know, most of the folks here. And I mean, it sounds like you yourself have some European ancestry as well. So you, too, are a legacy of Christopher Columbus in a very real way.
Yes, there are, you can go on YouTube and see where if contact had been delayed by a few hundred years, the consequences of disease may have been much more mitigated. But in addition, disease decimated who we are, who we were, when then it's layered on top of, oh, look at what great civilization and what technology we brought. We have no idea. It's a hypothetical to wonder or to imagine. What if Christopher Columbus never came? How would Native people have continued to progress? Because that's a lot of human history, right? Is that nobody lives the way that their ancestors did 200 years ago, right? 500 years ago. So it would have been interesting to see what we would have, as Native people, where we would have been at if that contact had been delayed by a couple of hundred years. It's a hypothetical, historical hypothetical, but you know, it's only relevant really in when we think about celebrating this contact, celebrating this person. We could change the name maybe to European Contact Day, but in particular, I guess, why most Native people are very uncomfortable is, why are we celebrating Columbus? He's not an honorable person, he's not an American, and the consequences of his contact were incredibly destructive and destroying of Native people throughout North America.
So I'd like to thank you guys for coming by today to CSU. I really appreciate it, and I want to thank you guys for starting this dialogue. So I had this question on my mind for a bit. So if this is like a really weird question. So what if there were another timeline universe where both these holidays weren't celebrating stuff? How do you think the dialogue would have been if both figures like Columbus and the concept of Indigenous Peoples Day didn't exist?
Would you care to elaborate on the question?
So I was asking, what would you think would have been the dialogue had these two holidays not existed?
What would the dialogue have been without these two holidays?
Yeah, if these holidays had never existed, how would things be different now? Is that essentially, yeah? Would it better, worse, different in other ways?
Well, I think that sort of Columbus Day is a celebration of sort of American essentialism, which I think has proved problematic for those who don't believe in it. I think it's had worldwide consequences upon other indigenous peoples, other marginalized peoples around the world. But so if neither of these holidays, I mean, if you're asking me, would I make a trade-off of, Professor Lau, forget about the Indigenous People Day. Would you be willing to just drop that if they would just drop Columbus Day? You bet.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it seems to me, as difficult and awkward as it is to have a Columbus Day with all the baggage that Christopher Columbus has, with all of the human suffering that came with the connection of the old world, again, Europe, but really by extension, the entire rest of the world with the Americas. For all of the pain that's involved there, nevertheless, this has been one of the most important developments in the history of the entire planet for all peoples everywhere. And I think Professor Lau actually just alluded to that as well. Whether or not it's American essentialism, it certainly is the case that so much of what exists in the world now, including the spread of democracy across continents, including the spread of the idea of human rights, these universal ideas, as well as the technologies, both for good and for bad, all of this owes so much to the fact, first of all, of course, that the United States exists. It's been a pivotably important nation over the course of the last century and more. But of course, then the United States, its own existence is made possible by the fact that one man was daring enough to cross the seas into literally uncharted territory at the risk of his life. And that man happened to be Christopher Columbus. And he succeeded, and he brought about a change not only in the Americas and not only in his own times, but a change that ultimately has brought us all to where we are today. And so that's why he has to be remembered. He has to be discussed both for his virtues and his vices, both for the benefits and the harms that this change brought about. But it's a change that I think is second to almost none in the history of, not just one people or another, or one civilization or another, but in the history of the entire planet. And therefore, I think, it's appropriate to have a Columbus Day, as controversial as it might be, in order to have conversations like this that raise vitally important questions which can't be glossed over.
Well, and I'll just add, we're in Ohio, right? And I retired from teaching just in August from teaching at Ohio State. And those conversations, it's sounding like you're suggesting this is an opportunity for some really good conversations about Columbus and the consequences of that contact, of the man himself, those sorts of things. Under SB 1, as many of you know, this is not going to be allowed anymore, right? You can't get involved into political or controversial topics. And next year, as I understand it, our syllabi are going to be examined by outsiders who will glean all of that stuff out. I've got a part of an article I contributed to the Smithsonian publication about the Newark earthworks. And I was writing about what the land means to us as indigenous people. I just got it back from the editor, and the Smithsonian Press has suggested either we don't print any of my comments or we only print half of them. They've been redlined because that's not a happy story. That's not positive. That's a critique, and we don't do critique anymore. So until this political era ends, I think it's unfortunately naive to think that we can just have straight, honest dialogue like we're having today. See whether this happens in 3 years. I suspect it might not.
We do have time for a few more questions. I will just say, Dr. Lau, that we may have a little different reading of what SB 1 allows, but we're going to keep right on having conversations like this, and if anyone in Columbus has a problem with it, they can take it up with me. So we have another question.
Thank you for speaking. I wonder if you guys could try to find a concept of indigeneity that you could both agree on. It seems that your concept, Dr. Lau, requires a little bit too much length of time to claim it, and your concept doesn't really seem, it sort of is almost a non-concept for you. But indigeneity seems to be connected to the right to self-defense, the right to territorial integrity, the right to exclude foreign peoples from your land. So I'm wondering if it's a danger in throwing out the concept, or if there's something else we can use to build up the concept of sovereignty, territorial integrity, et cetera, a people. Thank you.
I had suggested, I'm not sure if I'm understanding what you're suggesting, if it comports with what I was suggesting, because as I mentioned, if you want to claim Ohio as the place that you're indigenous from, you could be here 5 years, but this is my home, this is where I'm from, I claim this space, and that's fine. Or if people want to go back on Ancestry.com and find out where their people came from, that's fine too. Or if, like with me, I'd mentioned, that I'm part Irish American, so Ireland. So that'd be a natural. But as far as that then leading into territoriality and protection, and that's sovereignty does not mean you have the right to kill anybody that comes onto your land. Sovereignty means that you are self-governing, right? That you are able to determine your own affairs. And so I'm not sure if we're in comport with our understandings of what indigeneity means. What I mean it to be is that you are of the land. Which land? You get to choose, you identify.
Yeah, I think the question, it raises something that's actually a key element in the tragedies of indigenous American relations with the American settlers and with so much of European colonization, because you had different concepts of sovereignty, different concepts of what it meant to form a correct attachment to the land, and different ideas of property rights as well, of course. So one of the current considerations in examining the philosophy of John Locke, one of the current topics in scholarship is, does the Lockean understanding of appropriation of land by mixing one's labor with it, and then demarcating that, perhaps by putting up a fence, but is that so culturally specific that it winds up, in fact, necessitating a kind of imperialism? Because you're saying, well, look, I've come to this country. It has a fairly low population relative to where I came from, and I see some orchards, I see things without fences. I can come and I can plant my crops in the fields. I can pick the fruits of the orchards. I can mix my labor with the natural world, and I can put up a fence around it, and I can say, this is now my property. And if you come and you steal my apples, well, I can use, not kill, but I can certainly use some degree of force to keep you off my property, to take my apples back. But then you might say, hey, I understand these apples as being given to, or in fact, these apples are traditionally apples that my tribe or my people, in moving across a large segment of territory, have had access to, and you've now cut that off by putting up a fence. And therefore, you are actually committing an aggression against me by cutting off my access, or the access of my people, to these apples. And now I might use violence against you in order to tear down your fence or to stop you if you try to stop me. This is exactly how you wind up not only with conflicts between indigenous Americans, indigenous Indians, as Columbus called them, and Europeans coming over to the Americas, but of course this is also very much a story of Europe and of Asia and the Old World world itself, that you would constantly have these kinds of conflicts breaking out among peoples who had different forms of state organization, different understandings of what it meant to claim land as your own, both personally and also for your people. So again, this is one reason why it seems to me that ultimately a universal scope and a universal scale, a universal story, which one would hope would be the true story, but even if one wants to be more skeptical about that and simply say, we don't know whether this universal story is true or not, but it is something that's been able to take hold all across the globe, ultimately it's these universals that are going to be important even for defending particulars, even for defending the rights of particular peoples in particular places, because there's going to be a communication, an interaction, an encounter between peoples who have radically different understandings. And so if you don't have a universal that's able to connect and sort of override those particular points of view and to bring them all under one human umbrella, you're going to have just force against force, and that's going to be a disaster. Of course, universalisms can also be, especially in their contacts with previously isolated particular kinds of stories, can lead to conflict. So this is not just a tragedy that has a simple philosophical solution or a simple practical, political solution. This is actually the task of being a human being active not just as a citizen of your own community, whether that's an indigenous community or the community of U.S. citizens today, whatever it might be, but it's the conflict and the tension between your own community and the fact that we're also members of a larger universal human community as well, and these things don't always reconcile easily with one another, and you have to be able to defend a little bit of both in order to have, and also recognize that peoples who are very different from you not only are under a universal umbrella, but also you should recognize their particularities too. So all of these things are tremendous challenges. I think the question is really excellent, and I can't say that there's any simple solution to them, other than you have to engage in these difficulties and tensions in good faith.
Hi, thank you for both your comments. This question's mostly for Dr. McCarthy. I was just wondering to what extent you think the holiday rises or falls with finding him admirable. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it depends on finding him admirable. I think it depends on finding him historically extremely noteworthy in a way that has a, I would say a direct effect. Obviously, it's a direct effect over the course of, a couple of hundred years, but a direct effect in making possible the America in which we live today. So it's more about the discovery itself and that connection. But also, but I would not want to abstract it to such a degree that you remove the fact that there was a flawed human being who made that connection. And so that's why I think, it's not about necessarily admiring Columbus as an individual. That's a separate case that could be made in a separate program. But it is about recognizing the importance and ultimately the value, the goodness of what he did by making this connection and by making possible this universality and the particular America that we live in today.
We do have time for, I think, one more question.
Thank you again for coming out. I just wanted to ask, where would the premise of a compromise fall between your opinions? Such as celebrating both holidays, giving them separate days. It seems that they are not contradictory of each other, specifically Professor Lau's idea of indigenous peoples holiday. Does that just not reconcile, or would this be a very possibly applicable solution to this disagreement? Because both holidays have significant relevance to multiple large groups of people in this nation. And so, yeah, would this be a possible solution to such disagreements?
So should we have both holidays?
Yeah, it seems to me, based upon the history and from my previous conversations over the years, that Columbus Day really serves in particular as sort of you know, through K through 12 as a celebration of Europe and the old world bringing stuff to the new, which is, you know, I don't buy that. In addition to that, as I mentioned during my talk, is that, you know, the Knights of Columbus and the Italian-American community wanting to be legitimate, considered equal immigrants to the United States really pushed for this holiday. You know, and certainly those immigrants from Italy were not the first or the last to be discriminated against as they come to the United States. So I think that in other forums, I've had proud sons and daughters of Italy really vehemently distressed with the idea of giving up Columbus Day. I don't think that, but I've also been in audiences where Native people are extremely upset with celebrating Columbus Day and don't understand why we can't have an Indigenous Peoples Day, either, you know, alongside or instead of. You know, there are places like at the Ohio State that celebrate both days. For the academic calendar, they celebrate it the day after Thanksgiving so that we can all have the day off. You know, that's how important they think it is. You know, it's not in October, it's November 29th or whatever. And so, but I also wanted to respond to your very powerful words about how this center will never bow to pressure from the state legislature. That's what the last president said at Ohio State, and she's no longer there. So we'll see how that goes.
I'm not a president.
Yeah, but we'll see how that goes. Because our current president also said that we would never bow until SB 1 was passed, and then, oh, well, we have to bow.
So although I think we do have, you know, a real difference of opinion on Columbus and Columbus Day, I can imagine several kinds of alternatives that would evade some of the difficulties that we've talked about. So what happens with President's Day is it actually evolved out of Washington's birthday. You also had Lincoln's birthday in close proximity. And now we have this generic thing called President's Day, which is really not serving much of a purpose. It's not reminding people of George Washington. It's not, you know, celebrating Lincoln in particular. It's just presidents in general, which is kind of a bad thing if you think about it, because why do presidents get their own day, but Congress doesn't get its own day, the Supreme Court doesn't get its own day? It's a weird way of, you know, looking at our Constitution to do that. So I don't like what President's Day has become. I think there's a good case to be made for just George Washington's birthday, again, as, you know, the founder, as the, you know, first president, which again, you know, that's a record that he doesn't share with anyone else. But you can see why these things happen. And in the case of something like Columbus, I could easily see that, you know, I could imagine if someone were to propose we should have a day honoring great explorers, and that can be Columbus Day, but we're also going to honor America's astronauts and any number of other folks. I think that would actually be very popular, and that would be, in a way, that would be a bigger threat to Columbus Day than Indigenous Peoples Day, because there you get this culture war clash between Indigenous peoples and Columbus, whereas you could evade that whole thing by simply saying, let's honor exploration, everyone loves astronauts, and so, you know, that would happen. As far as more local celebrations are concerned, I think, you know, every locality, every state, every university is well within its rights to honor whom they want to honor and not, you know, those they don't want to honor. So even though if I were a member of, you know, the Cleveland State community or perhaps, you know, another university, I would argue for Columbus Day. I'm, you know, I would be willing to accede, okay, you know, most of the students here prefer to have Indigenous Peoples Day, so that's what we're going to have. And I don't, you know, I like the idea of, you know, every day could be a holiday, but since it's not practical, we do have to make choices, and the choices should be made usually at a more local level. And I agree with Professor Lau, by the way. I thought this idea of, you know, maybe you should celebrate Ohio. I think that's a great idea, or celebrate the fact you're an Ohioan. I think that your state should do that, and maybe your localities too. So I'm open to all of those kinds of ideas. When it comes to the federal government, I think, you know, celebrating founders has a particular logic to it that other kinds of days named after individuals usually don't. And as I say, you know, I'm kind of skeptical in general about the number of federal holidays we've added since the 19th century. But if we're going to have them, I think Columbus has a very good case for having his.
Okay, on that note, I would like to bring our program to a close, and as I mentioned earlier, invite you all to a reception that we have right behind you there. Thank you very much for coming, and please, and also to the audience that is on the live stream, thank you for tuning in. And again, please join me in thanking our speakers today one last time.